Claussen. I'm a senior here at WKU in the Potter College of Arts and Letters. I'm studying journalism and political science. For my capstone experience project, I chose to focus on media bias. As a journalist, it's an issue that is deeply important to me. Despite the bad apples, there are many hardworking, ethical journalists who are putting in the thankless work to keep voters informed and aware of important issues in our world. I believe it's important for news consumers to be aware of issues with the mainstream news media's political reporting so that they can be more effective at filtering out opinion from reporting. My project consists of 2 in-depth news stories, a research paper, and a reflection essay. So my first news story provides an overview of the issue, while my second news story focuses on the history of media bias. And my research paper focuses on newspaper endorsements. So why is journalism important? That's a great question. News reporters have historically served an essential role in our democracy. It was reported that British politician Edmund Burke said that there were 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporters' gallery yonder there sat a 4th estate far more important than them all. This phrase, the 4th estate, has come to refer to the press's job as a government watchdog. Margaret Sullivan, in her book Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy, wrote extensively about the results of local journalism dying off in small towns around the country. The result was corruption flourishing and government efficiency failing. Though her focus was on local government, there's no doubt that this applies to all levels of democracy. Without a free press, there is no one to tell the electorate what our representatives are doing or hold government officials accountable. James A. Garfield, the 20th US president, said, "Things don't turn up in this world unless somebody turns them up." This is why we have a free press. As of December of last year, 60% of Americans had little to no confidence that journalists act in the best interest of the public, according to the Pew Research Center. This is deeply concerning because our profession relies on credibility with our audience so that they can trust the news we bring them. After all, journalism is about serving the people, not an agenda. Speaking of agendas, 74% of Americans are concerned that media company owners are influencing news coverage to push an agenda, according to a Gallup poll. This share is up 5 points since 2017. It is worth noting that though claims of media bias are typically attributed to conservatives, this is a bipartisan issue. Obviously, you don't get 4 out of every 5 Americans believing we have a slanted news media if it's only conservatives that are complaining. Because so few people trust the national news media, the question is, where do people turn for their news? The answer is what I call opinionists, also known as alternative media. These are media organizations that openly favor one political side or the other. We're watching this shift happen before our eyes. CNN's viewership dropped 90% overall in the first week of 2022, according to Nielsen ratings. The network averaged 548,000 viewers during the week of January 3rd, whereas during that same week the year prior, they averaged 2.7 million viewers. Meanwhile, the Joe Rogan Experience podcast averages 11 million listeners per episode. The Daily Wire, a conservative media company, has grown into a $100 million a year company in only 5 years. Consumers want media they can trust, and alternative media feels trustworthy because they are openly biased and they're not hiding their agenda. As I was researching, I became very interested in how the decline of trust in the media began and brought us to present day. I spoke with Dr. Andy Tucker, a media historian and journalist who is the director of the PhD program at the Columbia Journalism School. She said there have been several cycles of declining trust in the media that have ebbed and flowed with political and cultural events such as World War I and II, the propaganda surrounding World War I, and the effect that had on people. Dr. Tucker believes part of the all-time low media trust is the influx of information that comes at us from all sides all day long, a lot of it competing with each other, and people consider much of it to be journalism. There's a whole empire of social media where you can find any truth that you want, and it's challenged people to find organizations they trust and to know and understand why they trust them. I also spoke with Dr. Rich Shoemate, an assistant professor here in the School of Media, who last year released a book titled Barry Goldwater, Distrust in Media and Conservative Identity, The Perception of Liberal Bias in the News. Dr. Shoemate traced the beginning of media bias to the early 1960s, when conservatism began to emerge as a political movement during the Barry Goldwater presidential campaign. Goldwater's campaign brought the conservative movement more towards the right. His campaign was a disaster, and it was one of the worst losses in American history. Dr. Shumate said conservatives began to believe that the media was dumping on Goldwater, which is where this got started. Dr. Shumate also noted that 1965 was when the term liberal bias began to creep into the lexicon with regard to the media. In my own research, I began looking at another angle that shaped the media we know today, the Fairness Doctrine. So the Fairness Doctrine was a rule from the Federal Communications Commission which required FCC-licensed TV and radio stations to A, devote airtime to controversial issues of public importance, and B, air opposing views on those issues. Translation, a broadcast station cannot present a hot-button issue from one side of the debate. Eventually, after many legal challenges, a Supreme Court case, and pressure from Congress, the doctrine was revoked in 1987. This led to a red wave of conservative talk show hosts in the late 80s and early 90s, including Rush Limbaugh's legendary radio show in 1988. The advent of 24-hour cable news changed the journalism landscape for good. Instead of a nightly news broadcast, stations like CNN and Fox News must fill every minute of every day with newsy noise of some sort. Without editors to carefully analyze their reporting, broadcasters have free rein during their shows. The majority of what fills these 24-hour news stations are opinion and commentary rather than reporting, which can further erode the trust in media and perception of political bias, especially when confused with journalism. And then came the internet. Undoubtedly, the single biggest factor in the modern transformation of the news business. As social media grew, journalists had to compete in a sensationalized culture. You cannot overstate the significance of social media and the decline of trust in media, because social media is optimized for attention rather than quality. Sensationalism is a problem that continues to influence our modern media landscape and the nature of reporting, as Rachel Moran, who works for the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public, told the Washington Post. For decades, newspapers have endorsed candidates in races from city council to the White House. Despite being an election season trademark, what impact does the endorsement have on voters? The consensus seems to be that presidential endorsements don't have significant effect. It is important to understand that endorsements are not made by those reporting the news, but by a separate entity known as the editorial board. Editorial boards decide as a group which candidates to support and why, independent from those who cover and write the news. Some newspapers choose to endorse candidates because they believe it would be an abdication of their leadership to sit out elections. Some discontinue their endorsements for fear of alienating a portion of their audience. Though the editorial board responsible for endorsements are separate from the news department, many people don't understand that. They just see that the paper endorsed a candidate, and many editors see a risk to credibility because of that. The fact is, as far as presidential elections are concerned, information on candidates is readily available and easily found. But for local races, most people aren't familiar with the candidates, even though local offices are the ones that shape our communities. Local media outlets and newspapers are the only ones who will be covering these races, and they will be able to interview and thoroughly research candidates for their readers. Okay, that was it. The media's role in elections is hardly diminishing, but rather growing and affecting electoral behavior on a greater scale. As political polarization grows, the bias of mainstream media outlets grows with it, perpetuating a cycle of one-sided information and half-baked opinions. To truly grow past the tendency to demonize the other side of the political aisle, we must learn to seek out the facts beyond the commentary on cable news shows and learn from other points of view.